They say every generation is a reaction to the one before it. They say youth is careless, impatient, dramatic. They say time will soften it all. But what if this generation didn't become sensitive by choice? What if it learned sensitivity the way skin learns pain, by repeated exposure? Gen Z grew up watching the world fracture in real time. Economic fear before adulthood, digital connection without emotional safety, constant visibility, rare understanding. This isn't a generation addicted to attention. It is a generation trained to survive under observation. Behind the memes, the irony, the humor that looks like detachment, there is something quieter. A nervous system that never fully rests. A mind that learned too early that stability is temporary. A heart that wants meaning, but fears disappointment. Why does Gen Z feel everything so deeply, yet trust so cautiously? Why does hope feel heavy instead of light? Why does silence feel safer than certainty? This isn't a story about trends. It's about the inner weather of a generation growing up during emotional noise. Let's begin. There was a time when mistakes disappeared with the afternoon light. A wrong answer in class. An awkward sentence. A failed attempt at being liked. For Gen Z, those moments didn't dissolve. They lingered, saved in screenshots, archived in comment sections, replayed in the mind long after everyone else moved on. This generation didn't just grow up online. It grew up seen. From an early age, there was an invisible audience. Watching, judging, measuring reactions. Silence became suspicious. Expression became risky. When every version of yourself can be recorded, the mind adapts. It scans before it speaks. It edits before it feels. It asks, how will this look? Before asking, how does this feel? This is not vanity. It is vigilance. Psychologically, constant observation reshapes identity formation. Instead of discovering the self privately, the self is negotiated publicly. Personality becomes something to manage. Emotion becomes something to curate. And slowly, without ceremony, emotional privacy erodes. Gen Z learned early that visibility brings connection, but also exposure. That being authentic can invite understanding, or ridicule. That silence can feel safer than honesty. So the mind develops a quiet habit, self-monitoring, not as insecurity, but as protection. Even joy becomes cautious. Even excitement is softened, because celebration can be misunderstood, and misunderstanding can echo. Older generations learned who they were before the world responded. Gen Z often learned through the response. Likes became feedback loops. Comments became mirrors. Algorithms became invisible teachers, rewarding certain traits, ignoring others. Over time, this creates a subtle internal split, who you are, and who you allow yourself to be seen as. This isn't weakness, it's adaptation. A nervous system raised under observation learns to stay alert. It learns to anticipate reaction before intention. It learns that attention is powerful, but unpredictable. And beneath the confidence often projected, there is a quieter question. Is it safe to be fully seen? For many in Gen Z, that question never fully rests. It hums in the background, like a light that never turns off. This is where the story begins. Not with fragility, but with awareness shaped too early. They say childhood is meant to feel safe, predictable, grounded. But for many in Gen Z, safety felt conditional, temporary, something that could change overnight. This generation did not grow up after crises. It grew up inside them. Economic crashes spoken about at dinner tables. News alerts before bedtime. Parents stressed, working harder, worrying silently. Global events unfolding not as distant history, but as live footage. Instability wasn't explained, it was absorbed. Psychologically, when uncertainty becomes routine, the mind adapts by staying ready, ready for change. Ready for loss, ready for disappointment. Hope becomes cautious, plans become flexible, certainty begins to feel unrealistic. For Gen Z, adulthood didn't look like arrival, it looked like survival with better tools. Even success felt fragile. Jobs disappeared. Systems failed. Promises shifted. So trust learned to move slowly. This isn't pessimism, it's pattern recognition. When the ground shakes often enough, The body remembers even when things are calm. The nervous system doesn't wait for proof. It prepares. Many in Gen Z learned early that stability is not guaranteed. That effort does not always equal reward. That institutions can fail quietly, without apology. And so ambition took on a different shape, less about climbing, more about protecting balance. This is why certainty feels heavy, why long-term promises feel intimidating, why commitment, whether to careers, systems, or even dreams, can feel risky. It's not a lack of motivation. It's a sensitivity to collapse. Emotionally, this creates a quiet contradiction, a desire for security paired with a disbelief that it will last. A longing for calm, mixed with an expectation of interruption. So Gen Z learns to live in short chapters, adaptable, prepared, alert. They don't assume permanence. They manage expectations. Even joy is sometimes held lightly, because joy that arrives suddenly can disappear just as fast. This generation didn't inherit laziness or entitlement. It inherited awareness. Awareness that the world can change faster than reassurance can catch up. And beneath the humor, the irony, the casual tone, there is a serious understanding. Nothing is guaranteed. This is the emotional soil Gen Z stands on, not barren, but unstable. And roots grow differently in shifting ground. The human nervous system was not designed for constant input. It evolved for rhythm, for pauses, for silence between moments. Gen Z grew up without those pauses. Notifications arrived faster than thoughts could settle. Information never slept. Bad news traveled instantly. Comparison was always one scroll away. The body learned to stay awake. From a psychological perspective, this creates a state of low-level alertness, not panic, not crisis, but readiness. When stimulation never ends, the nervous system stops distinguishing between what matters and what doesn't. Everything feels important. Everything feels urgent. Everything feels close. This is why exhaustion can exist without physical effort. Why rest doesn't always feel restorative. Why quiet can feel uncomfortable instead of calming. The mind becomes a crowded room, with no exit. Gen Z didn't become sensitive because it is fragile. It became sensitive because it was trained to notice everything. Tone, timing, subtext, reaction. This hyper-awareness looks like anxiety from the outside, but internally, it often feels like responsibility. A responsibility to stay informed, to stay socially aware, to stay emotionally available, to stay relevant. And the cost of this constant readiness is subtle but persistent. Difficulty focusing deeply. Emotions that spike quickly. A sense of being overwhelmed without a clear reason. Psychology doesn't call this weakness. It calls it overload. When the brain is exposed to endless novelty and comparison, dopamine pathways change. Attention becomes fragmented. Satisfaction becomes short-lived. Calm begins to feel unfamiliar. Not because Gen Z lacks discipline, but because the environment rewards alertness over stillness. Even relaxation becomes productive. Even rest is optimized. Even self-care is measured. And beneath all of it, the nervous system asks a quiet question. When is it safe to stop paying attention? For many, the answer never fully arrives. This is why silence can feel loud. Why boredom can feel threatening. Why slowing down can trigger guilt, instead of peace. Yet within this sensitivity is also capacity. Empathy sharpens. Awareness deepens. Perception becomes nuanced. Gen Z feels the world intensely because it has been living inside intensity. The problem is not that the nervous system is broken. It's that it has been asked to do too much for too long. And when the body stays alert without rest, it doesn't scream. It hums. Constantly, quietly, persistently. They say passion gives life direction. That purpose makes sacrifice worthwhile. That if something truly matters, it should be chased without hesitation. But for Gen Z, meaning often comes with a question mark. Not because purpose is unimportant, but because it feels exposed. To care deeply is to risk disappointment. To commit fully is to make loss possible. To believe is to open the door to collapse. This generation wants meaning, but it has seen how easily meaning can be exploited. Careers that promise fulfillment and deliver burnout. Systems that praise dedication and quietly drain it. Dreams that demand everything, then disappear. So caution enters the heart. Psychologically, this creates an internal negotiation. The desire to engage fully, and the instinct to stay guarded. You can see it in the language. I love it, but. I'm interested but. I care but not too much. Detachment becomes a boundary. Not because Gen Z is indifferent, but because caring without safety feels unsustainable. This is where many misunderstandings begin. From the outside, restraint can look like apathy. Hesitation can look like laziness. Boundaries can look like a lack of ambition. Internally, it feels very different. It feels like managing emotional exposure. Like rationing energy. Like protecting something fragile, not weakness, but hope. When the future feels unstable, intensity becomes risky. So passion is tempered. Dreams are held loosely. Expectations are lowered, not from lack of vision, but from lived experience. This inner conflict often creates quiet grief. Grief for the excitement that never fully arrives. For the confidence that feels irresponsible. For the wholeheartedness that feels unsafe. Even joy can feel conditional, as if happiness must justify itself, as if excitement needs a backup plan. So Gen Z learns to care carefully, to balance meaning with self-preservation, to search for purpose that doesn't consume, to want deeply, but not destructively. This isn't fear of failure, it's fear of depletion. And beneath the restraint there is still longing, still curiosity, still a desire to contribute something real. But the question remains, can meaning exist without costing everything? This tension doesn't resolve easily. It lives quietly inside decisions, inside hesitation, inside the pause before commitment. And for Gen Z, that pause is not emptiness. It's consideration. They say laughter is light. That jokes are meant to entertain. That humor means something doesn't hurt anymore. But sometimes humor arrives before healing. For Gen Z, laughter often comes wrapped around discomfort. Irony softens what would otherwise feel too exposed. Sarcasm creates distance from feelings that run too close to the surface. A joke is safer than a confession. In digital spaces especially, humor becomes a translation tool. Pain rewritten as relatability. Fear reshaped into something shareable. Exhaustion turned into a punchline. Not because the pain isn't real, but because naming it directly feels risky. Psychologically, humor acts as a buffer. It allows emotion to move without overwhelming the system. It gives control to the person expressing it. When something is joked about, it feels contained, managed, less likely to spill. This is why self-deprecating humor appears so often. Making fun of oneself first reduces the sting of being misunderstood later. Turning vulnerability into comedy prevents it from being taken hostage by judgment. From the outside, this can look like detachment, like emotional distance, like nothing is taken seriously. But beneath the laughter there is attentiveness, a careful reading of the room, a deep awareness of tone, a desire to connect without asking for too much. Humor becomes a social language that says, I'm aware, I'm human, I'm struggling, but I won't burden you. Memes especially serve a quiet psychological function. They compress complex emotions into simple recognition. A shared image replaces a long explanation. Validation arrives without exposure. Someone sees it and thinks, that's me. And for a moment the isolation loosens. But humor also has a cost. When everything becomes a joke, seriousness feels unsafe. When pain is always laughed at, it rarely gets held. Relief arrives, but resolution doesn't. So exhaustion hides behind wit. Sadness learns timing. Fear waits its turn. This doesn't mean Gen Z avoids depth. It means depth has learned to wear a mask. Laughter becomes a shield, not to deny feeling, but to survive it. A way to stay connected without becoming unprotected. And sometimes behind the joke, there is a quiet wish. that someone will hear the truth underneath the laughter. They were told strength looks like persistence, that resilience means pushing through, that success belongs to those who can endure without breaking. But Gen Z watched endurance turn into exhaustion. They saw burnout praised as dedication, silence rewarded as professionalism, emotional suppression reframed as maturity, and something in them hesitated. Not rebellion, recognition. Psychologically, this generation began to question a long-held equation: suffering equals worth. They noticed how often strength was measured by how much pain someone could tolerate without speaking, how vulnerability was framed as instability, how rest was postponed indefinitely. So they paused. Strength to Gen Z began to look different. Less about pushing harder, more about knowing when to stop. This doesn't come from fragility. It comes from observation. They saw the cost of unexamined resilience. Relationships thinned, health deteriorated, joy postponed. So boundaries emerged, not as walls but as preservation. Saying no became a form of honesty. Stepping back became a way to stay intact. Listening to emotional signals became an act of intelligence. From the outside, this shift can look like avoidance, but internally, it feels like self-respect. Psychology recognizes this as adaptive resilience, the ability to regulate rather than override, to respond rather than suppress. Gen Z isn't rejecting effort. It's questioning the requirement to suffer silently for legitimacy. This is why conversations about mental health feel natural here. Not because distress is greater, but because naming it feels necessary. They are not trying to be defined by pain. They are trying not to be consumed by it. Rest becomes strategic. Meaning becomes conditional on well-being. Success becomes something that doesn't require disappearance. This redefinition creates friction with older narratives. But it also creates possibility. A future where strength includes gentleness. Where awareness is valued as much as endurance. Where staying whole matters. This isn't the end of resilience. It's its evolution. And in that evolution, something opens a quieter, more sustainable way forward. They say the future belongs to the fearless, to the loud, to those who move without hesitation. But Gen Z is shaping something quieter. Not a future built on constant acceleration, but one that listens to its own limits. Not a world without ambition, but one where ambition is allowed to breathe. This generation carries sensitivity not as a wound but as information. It notices what overwhelms. It names what drains. It questions what no longer fits. And slowly this awareness changes the direction of growth. Psychologically, integration begins when a trait once treated as weakness is given context. Sensitivity stops being something to fight. It becomes something to understand. For Gen Z, this means learning to live with their nervous system, not against it. To honor caution without letting it become confinement. To allow meaning without demanding self-erasure. This is not about healing everything. It's about no longer denying what exists. Emotions don't need to be fixed to be respected. Uncertainty doesn't need to be conquered to be lived with. Gentleness doesn't need permission to be valid. A softer future doesn't mean an easier one. It means a more honest one. One where rest is not earned through collapse. Where expression doesn't require performance. Where being human is not treated as inefficiency. Gen Z may still carry alertness. Still hold humor close. Still hesitate before fully trusting. But within that hesitation is care. Within that caution is wisdom. Within that sensitivity is a different kind of strength. Like sediment settling in a river, clarity doesn't arrive through force. It arrives through patience. And perhaps that is what this generation offers the world: not certainty, but awareness. Not noise, but attunement. A reminder that progress does not always move faster. Sometimes it moves deeper. If parts of this reflection felt familiar, if something quiet inside you felt understood, you're not alone in that experience. Many people carry these feelings silently, assuming they are personal flaws rather than shared human responses to the world they grew up in. This space exists for moments like that. a place to explore the hidden corners of the human heart, without judgment, without pressure, without urgency. If you'd like to stay connected, you're gently welcome to subscribe and return whenever you need reflection more than answers. And if you feel comfortable, you're invited to share a thought or feeling in the comments. Only if you want to. Your words might help someone else feel less alone in theirs.